Hello, my name is Matthew Helke, and this is a presentation on the research that I did this summer at UC Santa Barbara. I worked in Professor Petzold's research labs, and there are a lot of other interesting projects going on at the same time as mine. And I won't go into too deeply into them, but they all involved modeling something or using a form of artificial intelligence. My own project involved something called reinforcement learning, which is a type of artificial intelligence. Reinforcement learning is a type of artificial intelligence algorithm that maximizes a reward. For example, if while playing Super Mario, it will try and get the highest number of coins when playing through a level. In this case, the number of coins that the Mario collects acts as a reward function, and a way of determining how well the algorithm is doing. The more coins it gets, the better it's performing. Also, reinforcement learning does not require a human to tell it what the best strategy is. It will learn the best strategy all on its own. And how does it do this? Through thousands upon thousands of trials. Eventually, the computer will be able to look at its prior successes and failures to come up with the best strategy to beat the game. Given enough time, computers can actually become better than humans at video games, among other things. Just recently, Google developed a program using reinforcement learning to play Go, a game which was previously thought to be unplayable by computers at a competitive level. This program then beat the world's champion at Go 80% of the time. Another team has created a program that learns how to play StarCraft, a video game that is very competitive, and is now currently much, much better than any human that can play it, reacting at instantaneous speeds. In the future, we want computers to be able to map out and model human brains, a process that can take teams of neuroscientists years just to map out one human brain. With reinforcement learning, this process could be reduced to months, maybe even days, and my research project is one step in that direction. Before I go into the details of my research projects, it is important to understand a classic reinforcement learning problem. This is a pathfinding problem. For example, imagine that each one of these nodes are a city, and each of the line connecting the nodes is a highway, and you want to get from the leftmost node, node 1, to the rightmost node, node 17. And what is the best way to get there? It might seem obvious that the best route would be go directly from 1 to 17 without going through any other nodes. However, each node has a cost associated with it. In this case, the cost would be the number of minutes it takes to go on that route. Going directly from 1 to 17 would be 400 minutes. And so obviously there must be a better solution. So using reinforcement learning, we can use trial and error to find the best option, without having to calculate every single path, which can be incredibly resource intensive. While calculating every single path on this simple matrix wouldn't be that hard, calculating it on a matrix with hundreds of millions of data points would be far too hard, and this is why reinforcement learning is the best option. When I applied my pathfinding algorithm to this problem, it identified the most efficient path, with the added benefit that it'd be able to identify efficient paths even on much more complex matrices. When I did my research project, I had access to data from a multi-electrode array, which is a world-class chip that a biology group at UCSB uses. What they did is put the chip on a small amount of mouse brain that they were able to grow in their laboratory, and then measure the neuron activity. My job was to take this data and to calculate the paths in which neurons fired, as well as to determine areas of neuron activity. In the data, each of those black spots would measure when neurons underneath it fired. And as you can see from the green graph, when there's a spike, that's when the neurons fired, and that's identified by a 1 in the data. However, when the neurons were silent, that was a 0. Since the raw data from the chip looked like this, it'd be impossible to calculate neuron pathways by hand. And since each recording lasted 3 minutes, with each of the 120 nodes taking a measurement every millisecond, there were over 21 million data points, which is too much for a conventional approach to calculate neuron pathways. So reinforcement learning was necessary. So to solve this problem, I applied the pathfinding algorithm from earlier that I had written to this problem to help deal with this massive amount of data. The cost of each pathway, which before was the number of minutes it would take to go from node to node, was calculated based on a function of how fast neuron impulses traveled. For example, if you had a neuron A that fired, and 10 seconds later neuron B fired, and the distance between A and B is the average distance an impulse travels in that amount of time, then the computer would be rewarded for finding a good connection, because it is likely that A caused B to fire. Thus, there's a neuron pathway between A and B. To summarize our research process, our collaborating group collects the data from the mouse brain. We examine it for spikes to determine when the neurons fired, and then what I did is I took that data and used it to construct a matrix, with each of those nodes on the electrode being a node on this new matrix, to help determine areas of neuron activity and to calculate the neuron pathways. My first challenge was to make a graph that could show when the spikes actually fired. Rather than just looking at a graph filled with ones and zeros, I could see what was actually going on in the chip. This recording is randomly generated, meaning that every single node has a 50-50 chance of firing, which means that it has a firing rate of 0.5. In reality, however, the neurons fire much, much less than this, with an actual firing rate of an average of 0.005. This is a clip from an actual recording of about 70 milliseconds long. Look how much less the neurons actually fire in this recording than with the randomly generated one. So I discovered that neurons firing are actually relatively rare, as out of 23 million instances, there are only 100,000 instances where a neuron's fired. Additionally, neurons only fired in this area with the arrows, and the computer identified that a neuron firing at one end of one of the arrows would result in a neuron firing at the other end of the arrows, thus implying a neural pathway. We believe that the data was like this because the neurons outside of that one specific area either did not function correctly or had died, and thus they weren't able to fire and we weren't able to measure activity. In the future, to improve this model, a lot more work would need to be done. For example, currently, if the computer identifies a connection between two nodes, it assumes that neuron impulses can travel either way, in either direction, like a two-way street. However, most neural pathways can only fire in one direction, like a one-way street. So in the future, a better model would be able to identify two distinct connections, whereas the current model would only see one. There's still an incredible amount of work to be done before computers are able to model the human brain effectively and quickly. However, every day more research is done and we get closer and closer to that end goal. In summation, it was possible for the computer to identify areas of neuron activity, just like how I was able to learn how to play Mario games. Another takeaway is that it's difficult to determine whether a connection is valid or not. While we can be reasonably certain that a calculated connection is the same as a real connection, with today's technology we cannot be 100% sure. In the future, this will improve. My final takeaway has impacted my behavior by far the most of any of the other takeaways. Just days before my final presentation, my hard drive failed. As this is the part of the computer that stores all the data, I thought for sure that all my work had been lost. Fortunately, someone had some very specialized tools and was able to salvage my data, and I was able to present on time. Now whenever I work on something, I always make sure to make frequent backups and to never have all of my data or work stored on one single place. Finally, I'd like to thank Yun Zhao, the PhD student who helped guide me through this entire process, as well as his professor, Professor Petzold, whose labs I worked in. Finally, after all this talk about matrices, here's one last matrix. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me any, but mention Neo in them so I'll know you watched until the very end. Thank you for watching!